Kong Confidential. I'm Jules Hannaford and I'm your host. I'm an Australian woman and I've been living in Hong Kong for many years. I'm a mother, a teacher, an author, and I want to share my wisdom and the wisdom of others with you. Thanks for joining me and I hope you enjoy the show. Hong Kong Confidential is brought to you by Teresa's Turkish Towels. Teresa imports the finest 100% Turkish cotton towels that dry very quickly, making them perfect for Hong Kong's humid climate. Say goodbye to the traditional smelly and stinky towels and try the colourful and fresh selections available online or in Teresa's Wan Chai store. Use the promo code CONFIDENTIAL online or mention this podcast when you visit in person to receive $100 off your entire order when you order 2 or more towels. With 100% satisfaction guaranteed or your money back, the only thing you've got to lose are the musty smells that permeate traditional terry towels. Visit www.hkturkish.com in order to get the address and directions to Teresa's semi-hidden location. Hi confidants, thanks for joining me. Today I'm talking to Dr. Michael Carr-Gregg, who is one of Australia's highest profile psychologists. He's the author of 11 books, a broadcaster and a specialist in parenting, children, adolescents, and the use of technology for mental health. Michael Carr-Gregg was in Hong Kong as the keynote speaker for the ESF Professional Development Day. I was lucky enough to catch Michael for an interview during this development day. It was a real pleasure to speak to him, and there's so much that we can all learn from this interview. I hope you enjoy it. Today I'm here with Michael Carr-Gregg, psychologist and author from Australia. Hi Michael, thanks for joining me today.
Good to be here.
So Michael, can you tell me a little bit about what you're doing here in Hong Kong?
So I'm talking about young people's mental health, staff mental health in schools, and how we might use technology to improve both.
Can you tell me a little bit about what you recommend for teachers to help students improve their well-being?
So I think the most important thing is that they have to be the change that they want to see in the young people. So putting an emphasis on the basic building blocks of well-being, like diet, exercise, meditation, and the things that I've been talking about today are really important. So we know that the mental health of school staff is actually not very good. In the order of about 40% of them really struggle with their mental health, and that's going to make it very difficult to be a good teacher. We're probably teaching the most vulnerable generation of young people ever, so we need teachers to be on their game.
Why do you think we're teaching the most vulnerable generation of young people?
Wherever you go in the Western world, the statistics would suggest that levels of depression, anxiety, self-harm, suicidal ideation, and actually completed suicide are on the rise.
What do you think are the key factors that are influencing this for young people?
There are more risk factors in their environment than ever before and fewer protective factors. So we think of risk factors as being within the individual, their peers, their family, their school, and in the community. So you take, for example, online pornography, that's reached saturation levels. The average age at which kids are seeing it is 11. It's now become the lead sex educator in Australian schools and indeed schools worldwide. That's disastrous.
So what can parents and teachers do to educate young people about pornography?
There's a fabulous resource called itstimewetalk.com.au, which gives parents and teachers the words to use and the concepts which need to be introduced to young people, because online pornography portrays sex as a performance. It's nothing to do with love or intimacy, and more importantly, consent. There's a lot of violence, and the research shows that young people who are exposed to this type of material, particularly at a young age, think it's okay to be violent and to hold people down and to brutalise them while they're having sex. And clearly that's not okay.
What do you think parents need to do to improve parenting skills in this day and age?
I've just finished a book called The Prince Buffhead Syndrome, which talks about the key strategies for parents raising kids in 2017. And the most important thing is to say no, to be the world expert on your kid, to know their psychology, to listen to their self-talk, to have consequences for poor choices, to be consistent, to handle meltdowns with dignity, have rituals and traditions, and most importantly, keep the lines of communication open.
And why do you think parents are struggling with some of these aspects in parenting in this generation?
Guilt. I think many parents are time poor. Many might have separated and have repartnered, and they've disrupted their children's lives. And as a result, they're feeling quite guilty. And there is a major motivation for some of these parents to be their child's best friend. That denies the developmental perspective, which is that children's brains aren't fully developed yet. It's not an equal relationship. Someone has to be the mentor. Someone has to set limits and boundaries.
You've coined the term the Princess Bitchface Syndrome and the Prince Buffhead Syndrome. What exactly are those?
These are small subsegments of boy and girl population who are incredibly disrespectful, contemptuous of their parents. They treat them very badly, and the key is they're allowed to treat them very badly. And to my mind, this is unacceptable. We need to put steel in the spines of these parents. We need to get them to name the behaviour when it's occurring and make sure it ceases.
What do you think are some of the key issues that are causing an increase in mental health issues in young people in this day and age?
Well, we've got a record number of marriages failing. So the average marriage in Australia lasts 8 years. That causes disruption. We have an unprecedented amount of physical, verbal and sexual violence in families, a lot of domestic violence. We have a lot of bullying and harassment when children are young. We have a lot of parents who work when they're young and children are farmed out to daycare. And we know that many of those children are okay, but some have a lot of cortisol, which is a stress hormone on their brain, and that can damage brains and set them up for lifelong depression and anxiety. So there are a whole range of these risk factors in their lives, which I don't think were there before. But the most important thing is the absence of protective factors, such as spirituality, such as having a consistent home where you're not moving around all the time. So rapid transitions is problematic.
What do you think the key things are that young people are worried about?
What the research says is their number one worry is coping with stress. Their number two worry is coping with school and study. And their number three worry is body image, all of which is totally understandable because life is more complicated now. I don't think they have the social and emotional competencies in terms of anger management, problem solving, decision making, conflict resolution, and therefore they find life much tougher than it's ever been before.
And what's your advice to parents or teachers if they feel like they've got a child who seems to be struggling with some sort of mental health issue? And what are some of the things they can look for to indicate?
Well, the second question first. If your child is not emancipating from you, if they're not making friends, if they're not managing school, if they are having difficulty figuring out the answer to the question, who am I? All of those things are potentially massively problematic. So those things are the ones to look out for. In terms of what we can do, I think there's an excellent book that's just been written, and I very rarely recommend books I don't write, but there's an excellent book that's just come out called Good Thinking by Sarah Edelman. You could probably get it on Amazon or something like that, but it's a really good book for young people to help them recognize that their feelings stem from their thoughts. And if we can modify our thoughts, we can actually modify our feelings. It's a brilliant little book by Sarah Edelman called Good Thinking.
Do you think that this generation knows how to cope with stress?
There's plenty of evidence that they don't. The Mission Australia study, which looked at 22,000 15 to 19-year-olds, clearly said that coping with stress was their number one problem. So if they were coping with it, it wouldn't be. And I'm not at all surprised, because I think the helicopter parenting, which many of them have been subjected to, where parents swooped down and rescued them when they were little, meant they never had any exposure to difficulties and never figured out how to solve their problems.
Well, can you tell me about the links between the internet and mental health?
Well, I think it's an interesting relationship. A lot of people want to demonise the internet, but I see it as a mechanism by which we can educate, support, treat, and I think assess young people using smartphone apps and using web-based programs. For example, if you have a child with anxiety, there's now an evidence-based program run by the University of Queensland called the BRAVE program. There's a brilliant program for depression called the Mood Gem, which has been subjected to something like 17 randomised controlled trials. So I think we shouldn't demonise the internet. I think we have to regulate the use of the internet for young people who don't have the capacity to regulate it for themselves. But I think it is also tremendously useful in terms of the number of apps and web-based programs and biometric devices that I've talked about with you today that are very useful.
And what's your attitude towards smartphones in schools?
Don't think we should have smartphones in primary school. I think we should have dumb phones. But I think I'm very happy for the secondary kids to have this as part of their learning. It's going to enhance their learning. I'm very, very supportive of schools that involve technology in learning.
How important do you think it is for early intervention for teens with mental health issues?
We know from the research that early intervention, prompt diagnosis and prompt treatment is associated with a really good outcome clinically. The problem we have is in schools, many kids with these problems pretend they don't have them. So they'll come to school wearing a mask. And unfortunately, this delays not only assessment, diagnosis and treatment, but it also increases the likelihood of comorbid problems like drug and alcohol problems and self-harm.
And how important is it for parents or teachers to have open conversations? And what would you advise if a young person is going through suicidal ideations or suicidal thoughts?
The most important thing is to ask them. And the sort of way that you can ask them is that, you've listened very carefully to what they've said, and you can imagine that anybody in that situation might feel like hurting themselves. Have they felt that way?
Can you tell me about Hannah Modra and the ABC series that you were involved in called The Girl Least Likely To?
So this is a story about a young woman who took her own life in Melbourne, and it's such a good story for everyone to look at because it shows how a girl can hide the symptoms of depression right up until it's too late, and she in fact ended her life. So I would recommend everybody to have a look at it.
Can you tell me a little bit about your analogy of the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff?
So at the moment, we've got a lot of very expensive ambulances at the bottom of the cliff, which represent highly trained people such as myself, who are constantly dealing with people who have literally fallen off the cliff and are struggling. And many of their problems are very complex. It would be more sensible to have robust fences at the top of that cliff. In other words, give young people the skills and the knowledge and the strategies to cope with their psychological problems prior to them falling over. That to me just seems a really good idea.
And given that young people spend so much time at school, what are some of the key things that schools can do to help manage this part of the process?
So the most important thing is to make sure they have the social and emotional competencies I talked about earlier. So when they're saying to, I don't know how to cope, well, we've got to teach them how to cope. Therefore, having instruction on things like anger management, problem solving, decision making, that's a no-brainer. We need to prepare them not just for the economy, but for life.
And so schools should have personal social health education programs.
It's exemplified by a program in Melbourne in Australia called Mind Matters. And if you Google Mind Matters, you'll see how many schools in Australia are now addressing this issue in what I consider to be a revolutionary way.
And can you tell me a little bit about how parents and teachers and young people can use technology to help with mental health issues?
So, for example, if you've got an anxiety disorder, there's an iPhone app called Reach Out Breathe, which uses the camera on the phone to pick up a person's pulse and help slow their breathing. Now, I can't be with all my clients when they're having a panic attack, but you can bet your bottom dollar they've got their phone. So if I can train them to use their phone in my clinic and then they've got it with them for the rest of their lives, that's a major improvement. So that's a clear example of the utility of this technology.
And parents and students and teachers can use this technology as well. It doesn't have to be a health professional.
Not at all. In fact, anyone with a telephone and an internet access can access this material.
So there are a multitude of apps out there that can be used, and some of them are things like Reach Out and Breathe and Reach Out Worry Time. Are there any other key apps that you might recommend for young people?
The best thing to do is to go to a website called beacon.com.au, which is put together by the Australian government, which has a list of all the apps that you'd ever need for any mental condition and tells you how evidence-based they are.
Oh, that's really fantastic. Thank you so much for that.
Welcome.
Can you just tell me a little bit about PSMI and what it is?
So the Black Dog Institute in Australia came out with a report this year suggesting that almost 1 in 4 young people in Australia had a probable serious mental illness. And this is really bad news. This is an illness that can potentially not only stop the developmental tasks of adolescence from occurring, but can actually be a precursor to youth suicide. So to have such an authoritative body come out with that report, which was data mined from the youth survey by Mission Australia, is huge, and we have to take notice of it. It's basically the psychological canary in the coal mine. It's warning us that if we don't act now, things are going to get really serious later on.
You've coined the term vitamin N deficiency. What does that mean?
Vitamin N refers to vitamin No. And I think across Australia, and certainly across Southeast Asia, there is an inclination for parents not to say no because they don't want to disappoint or upset their children. I think they need to hear no. You're not required to give an explanation. Parenting should not be an exercise in martyrdom. Every parent listening to this should know that they have a right to a quality of life and that they need time for themselves and they don't have to be the constant slaves of their children.
And how does this link to excessive expectations with young people themselves or parents with young people?
Well, it's both. So many young people will expect the world to be perfect for them, and of course it's not, and that they're not going to develop resilience. But worse, many parents will have expectations of their children which are completely unrealistic. I always say if you want to know anything about your children, ask their teacher, because they have objectivity. They don't have rose-coloured glasses on, and I think we as parents all do.
Yes, and that's really good advice.
Thank you.
What role do you think gender and sexuality plays in mental health issues for young people?
So I'm very concerned about the same-sex attracted kids and the transgender kids because the statistics suggest that they are at much higher risk of suicidal ideation, depression, anxiety. And I think they are one of 3 groups that I'm particularly concerned about. The first group being young women whose rates of depression and anxiety are very high. The transgender kids and kids in year 11 and 12 who are coming towards the end of school. So those are the 3 groups I'm most concerned about.
And what advice would you give to parents if they have a child who is worried about their gender or their sexuality?
Talk to them. Don't judge them. If you are at all out of your depth, go and see a psychologist who specialises in this area and know that there are many hundreds of thousands of transgender kids right across the world who live happy, productive lives.
Michael, is there anything else that you'd like the listener to be aware of?
Just that young people are 20% of the population, 100% of the future. We need to invest a lot more of our resources as a community in our young people, keeping them active, keeping them engaged, and that the worst enemy of any young person in 2017 is boredom. Therefore, I'm very, very happy for them to read books. I'm very happy for them to entertain themselves. But if you've got a kid who's perpetually bored, it might be that they're depressed and you need to check it out.
And my final question is, why do you think there's such a stigma with mental health issues, and how can we overcome that so that there can be more understanding and people accepting it and really being proactive about addressing these issues rather than trying to sweep it under the carpet?
I think this is a throwback from our Anglo-Saxon roots, where we had the stiff upper lip, where you just basically stuck your chin out and carried on. My father was in the war, and he basically never spoke about the war in the entire time that he was alive. And he never understood why people would pay me money to help them. As far as he was concerned, that was a complete waste of money and you should just get on with it. So I think that era, while it has got better, there's still remnants of that attitude, and I think it feeds the denial and the reticence to get help.
And so the work you're doing and the work we're all doing as teachers, that is really our goal, is to try and make that change so that it becomes much more socially acceptable and that people can reach out and get help earlier.
Absolutely. We have to get them to understand that having depression is an illness. In the same way that breaking a leg is an illness, you got to fix it.
Michael, thank you so much for your time today. I really, really appreciate it. And I'm sure the listeners out there are going to get a whole lot of information out of this that they'll be able to use well.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for talking to me.
Bye.
So that brings us to the end of another Hong Kong Confidential podcast. I'm Jules Hannaford. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you'll be with me again next week. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please can you go to iTunes to rate and review it. I would really appreciate your feedback. You can email me at jules@hongkongconfidential.net, and you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Hong Kong Confidential. If you'd like to hit me up on Twitter, it's at Jules Hannaford. I would love to hear from you.